In the summer of 1943, deep beneath a hillside in northern France, Nazi engineers were building a weapon so ambitious, so extreme, that even seasoned German officers struggled to believe it was real. It wasn't a rocket. It wasn't a bomber. It was a gun, designed to fire shells from France directly into the heart of London. What made it truly terrifying wasn't just its range. It was the idea behind it. A weapon that could strike Britain day after day, without warning, without interception, and without pilots risking their lives. Hitler believed this gun could break London's spirit once and for all. What he didn't realize was that the V3 program was already collapsing under its own weight, long before a single shot was fired. By 1943, Nazi Germany was no longer winning the war it had started. The defeat at Stalingrad had shattered the myth of German invincibility. Allied bombers were hammering German cities nightly. And across the Channel, Britain remained defiant. For Adolf Hitler, the answer was not retreat, but escalation. He demanded a miracle weapon. Something decisive. Something unstoppable. This obsession gave birth to the so-called Vergeltungswaffen, the vengeance weapons. The V1 flying bomb. The V2 rocket. And hidden in their shadow, the most bizarre of them all, the V3. Officially known as the Hauptstück pump, the high-pressure pump, the V3 was not designed like any conventional artillery piece. Instead of a single explosive charge, it used a series of secondary charges placed along an incredibly long barrel. As the projectile traveled forward, each charge would ignite in sequence, accelerating the shell again and again, pushing it to unprecedented speed. In theory, the shell would leave the barrel at hypersonic velocity. In theory, it could travel over 160 kilometers. In theory, London would be helpless. The chosen target area was the Pas-de-Calais region of France, the closest point to Britain. From there, German planners calculated that the V3 could rain destruction on London continuously, firing dozens of rounds per hour. But the theory hid a dangerous truth. No one had ever built a weapon like this before. And the physics were far less forgiving than Nazi optimism. Construction began at a massive underground complex near the village of Mimoyecques. The site was carved directly into solid chalk rock, protected by reinforced concrete and concealed from the air. At its peak, thousands of forced laborers worked around the clock, digging shafts, laying rails, and installing barrels angled precisely toward London. Each barrel was meant to be over 130 meters long. They were to be mounted in fixed positions, incapable of being moved or re-aimed. This wasn't artillery in the traditional sense. It was an immobile execution device, permanently locked on a single city. The weapon's designers assured Hitler it would work. They promised a relentless bombardment that no air defense could stop. But even as the complex took shape, warning signs were already everywhere. Early test firings exposed severe problems. The sequential charges did not ignite evenly. Shells became unstable inside the barrel. Some shattered before exiting. Others veered wildly off course. Most alarming of all, the barrel itself suffered extreme stress. Cracks formed. Metal warped. The tolerances required were far beyond what wartime German industry could reliably produce, especially under constant Allied bombing. Yet the project continued. Hitler was personally invested. He overruled skeptics. He dismissed engineers who raised concerns. In his mind, the V3 was not just a weapon, it was revenge. As 1944 approached, the pressure intensified. The Allies were preparing something massive across the Channel. German intelligence sensed it, but could not pinpoint when or where. The V3 was supposed to be ready before the invasion came. It never would be. Unbeknownst to the Germans, Allied reconnaissance aircraft had detected unusual activity at Mimoyecques. The size of the excavation, the rail lines, the ventilation shafts, something big was being built there. British analysts didn't yet understand what the weapon was. But they understood one thing clearly. Whatever it was, it couldn't be allowed to survive. The countdown toward the V-3's destruction had already begun. By early 1944, the Mimoyecques complex was no longer a secret, at least not entirely. Allied reconnaissance photos revealed something deeply unsettling. This wasn't a normal bunker. It wasn't a missile launch site. It was something far larger, buried deep into the hillside, with angled shafts pointing unmistakably toward England. British intelligence analysts studied the images again and again. They couldn't yet identify the weapon with certainty, but the scale alone raised alarms. The structure was massive, permanent, and clearly designed for sustained operations. This was not a one-time strike weapon. It was built for repetition. The Royal Air Force classified Mimoyecques as a priority target. If Germany was preparing a new method of bombardment, it had to be neutralized before it became operational. Meanwhile, inside the complex, German engineers were racing against time. The V-3 barrels were being installed in parallel shafts, each carefully aligned to ensure accuracy over extreme range. Every detail mattered. A slight deviation in angle could send a shell miles off target. But the deeper they went, the more the design betrayed its own ambition. The multi-charge ignition system was unreliable. Each secondary charge had to detonate at precisely the right moment. Too early, and it disrupted the projectile. Too late, and it added no velocity at all. Synchronization failures were common. Entire test runs ended with shells lodging inside the barrel, forcing dangerous manual clearing operations. Some detonated prematurely, destroying sections of the weapon before it could even be completed. Still, the project pressed forward. In Berlin, Hitler demanded progress reports. He envisioned London under constant fire, panic spreading through the population, government morale collapsing, retaliation finally achieved. What he did not see were the quiet compromises being made on the ground. Materials were substituted. Quality controls were loosened. Skilled engineers were replaced by forced laborers with minimal training. Time, not reliability, became the priority. Then the bombing began. In November 1943 and early 1944, the RAF launched repeated attacks against suspected V-weapon sites across northern France. Mimoyecques was hit multiple times, but its thick concrete and underground layout absorbed the damage. So the Allies escalated. In July 1944, the RAF deployed one of its most devastating innovations, the Tallboy bomb. Weighing over 12,000 pounds, it was designed not to explode on impact, but to penetrate deep underground before detonating. When Tallboy struck Mimoyecques, the effect was catastrophic. Entire tunnel sections collapsed. Rail lines twisted like wire. Ventilation shafts were crushed. Several barrel installations were permanently buried under tons of rock. Inside the complex, chaos followed. Communication lines failed. Power systems were destroyed. Survivors described deafening shockwaves rippling through the tunnels, followed by suffocating dust and darkness. The V-3 site was no longer functional. German command attempted to assess the damage, but the reality was unavoidable. Repairing Mimoyecques would take months, time Germany no longer had. And even worse news arrived soon after. On June 6, 1944, Allied forces landed in Normandy. The invasion Hitler had feared had begun. Suddenly, the Pas-de-Calais region was no longer a secure rear area. It was a battlefield about to be overrun. The V-3, still untested, still unreliable, was now in mortal danger. German engineers proposed relocating parts of the system. Smaller versions of the gun were suggested for use against closer targets. But the grand vision, London under relentless artillery fire, was slipping away. What had once been Hitler's ultimate revenge weapon was now a liability. By the summer of 1944, the V-3 program was unraveling faster than anyone in Berlin wanted to admit. The Mimoyecques complex, once envisioned as the centerpiece of Germany's vengeance, was effectively dead. But even in failure, the Nazi leadership refused to fully let go. Instead of abandoning the project outright, they attempted to salvage it. Engineers proposed a scaled-down version of the weapon, shorter barrels, fewer secondary charges, reduced range. These modified guns could no longer reach London, but they might still bombard Allied positions advancing through Western Europe. It was a desperate compromise. Several smaller V-3 installations were hastily assembled near Luxembourg, aimed at the city of Antwerp, which had become a crucial Allied logistics hub after its capture. Unlike the massive fixed guns planned for France, these versions were crude, unstable, and rushed into service. When they finally fired, the results were deeply underwhelming. The shells lacked accuracy. Many failed to detonate properly. Others fell far short of their targets or landed harmlessly in open countryside. The psychological impact was minimal. The military effect was almost non-existent. The weapon that was supposed to terrorize an entire capital city could barely disrupt supply lines. Behind the scenes, the reasons were painfully clear. The multi-charge acceleration system was simply too complex. Small timing errors compounded at extreme velocities. Structural weaknesses multiplied with each firing. Maintenance was constant, dangerous, and slow. Even Germany's own test data showed that the weapon could never achieve the reliability Hitler demanded. But admitting that truth was impossible. The V-3 had become symbolic. It represented hope, however delusional, that technology could reverse Germany's collapsing fortunes. To cancel it outright would have been to admit defeat. Meanwhile, Allied forces continued to advance. Northern France was liberated. Belgium followed. German territory itself was now under direct threat. Resources that might have stabilized the front were instead wasted on a weapon that never delivered. As 1944 turned into 1945, the V-3 faded into irrelevance. No mass production. No decisive strikes. No strategic impact. Only abandoned tunnels, shattered concrete, and thousands of lives expended in forced labor for a dream that never worked. When Allied troops eventually reached the Mimoyecques site, they found a ghost project. Collapsed shafts, twisted metal, incomplete barrels still pointing silently toward London. The gun that was meant to fire endlessly had never fired at all. In post-war analysis, Allied investigators were stunned by the sheer scale of the project and its futility. The resources invested were enormous. The return was zero. The V-3 was not defeated in combat. It collapsed under the weight of its own ambition. And in that failure, it revealed something profound about the final years of Nazi Germany. The belief that wonder weapons could replace strategy. That technology alone could overcome manpower, logistics, and reality. The V-3 was never just a gun. It was a symptom. When the war finally ended, the V-3 existed only as blueprints, fragments, and ruins buried beneath northern France. There was no victory parade for it. No battlefield legacy. No decisive moment. Just silence. Historians would later compare the V3 to Germany's other V weapons, and the contrast was striking. The V1 and V2, for all their flaws, actually reached their targets. They caused destruction, fear, and casualties. The V3 never did. It failed before the war could judge it. The reason wasn't a single bombing raid or a single engineering mistake. It was a chain of miscalculations layered on top of each other. An overestimation of technology, an underestimation of physics, a refusal to listen to engineers when reality conflicted with ideology. The gun demanded industrial precision that wartime Germany could no longer provide. It required uninterrupted construction, flawless timing, and materials that simply weren't available under constant Allied bombardment. And above all, it demanded time. Time Germany no longer had. The Mimoyecques site stands today as a reminder of how quietly failure can unfold. There was no dramatic explosion marking the end of the V3 program. No official cancellation order. It simply stopped. Crews abandoned the tunnels. Plans were shelved. Attention shifted to survival. The weapon that was supposed to dominate the future was overtaken by it. In the end, the V3 revealed something deeply human about the Nazi war effort in its final phase. Not just brutality, but desperation. A leadership clinging to fantasy as reality closed in. Hitler believed the V3 would break London. Instead, it exposed the breaking point of his own strategy. The most dangerous weapons are not always the ones that fire. Sometimes they are the ones that promise everything and deliver nothing. If you found this story of hidden failure compelling, take a moment to like the video. Subscribe for more untold Second World War mission that collapsed in silence. And let us know in the comments which forgotten operation you want explored next.